In this second video on diagramming relative clauses, we're going to talk about diagramming relative clauses which are introduced by relative adverbs. A relative clause can be introduced by a relative pronoun or by a relative adverb. In either case, the whole clause functions as an adjective, modifying or giving more information about one of the nouns in the sentence. When a relative clause is introduced by a relative adverb, it must meet the following three requirements. First, because it is a clause, it must have a subject, noun, and a predicate, verb. Second, it will be introduced by a relative adverb, when, where, why. Lastly, it will function as an adjective, answering one of the questions, which, what, kind, or how many. So we'll start with the sentence, Graceland, where Elvis lived, is now a museum. First, let's look at our main clause, which is Graceland is now a museum. Our relative clause is where Elvis lived, and it's introduced by the relative pronoun where. Remember, adverbs tell when, where, why, in what manner, to what extent. Let's go ahead and code it now. Our main verb in our main clause is the be verb, is, which is a linking verb in this case because we do have a subject complement. A predicate nominative, Graceland is a museum. Predicate nominative restates what the subject is. Our subject is Graceland. And before we move on, let's look at the main verb in our relative clause, which is lived. Our subject, who lived? Elvis lived. Now, Graceland has a subject complement, a predicate nominative, museum. One way to tell that you have a predicate nominative is you could reverse them. You could say a museum is Graceland. We have a couple of adverbs. Now is an adverb telling us when, is now. And where is our relative adverb, which is introducing our relative clause, where Elvis lived. Now we'll diagram it. We have our baseline and our bisecting line. And since we have a subject complement, predicate nominative, we put a slanted line instead of a vertical line after the verb. And our relative clause, where Elvis lived, and the key word in this clause is the relative adverb, which introduces the clause, and it ties the clause back to the noun that it's modifying, Graceland. So in our main clause, Graceland is the subject. Is the verb, a linking verb, since we have a subject complement. Graceland is museum. We have an article modifier, a museum. And our relative clause, our subject is Elvis. Elvis lived. It's a verb, lived. It's an action verb. And it's an intransitive verb because there's no object. And the relative adverb, which introduces this clause, is where. You can see it's joined to Graceland by that dotted line which runs between where and Graceland. And we do have an adverb up here in our main clause, now, which tells when. Here's another sentence, a question with a relative clause. Was there a time when you were really happy? Now our main clause is, was there a time? And our relative clause is, when you were really happy. And it's introduced by the relative adverb, when. Let's code it. Our main verb in the main clause is actually the first word in the sentence because it's a question. It's the past tense of the be verb, was. And was what? Well, in the main clause, we really have two choices, there or time. Well, there is an adverb. Could be telling where or when. Time is a concept, so that's our subject. So we'll put our little light bulb over that. Our main verb in the relative clause is also a past tense of the verb to be, were, which makes our subject you. Okay, we have an adverb in our main clause, which is there. We have an adjective in the relative clause, happy. You were happy. It's a subject complement. And then we have another adverb. How happy were you? Really happy. It's an adverb modifying an adjective. And we have our relative adverb, which introduces our relative clause, when. A lot of modifiers in this sentence. Let's go ahead and diagram it. We have our baseline for our main clause, baseline for our relative clause, dissecting lines in both cases to separate the subjects from the verbs. And we know that we have a subject complement in the relative clause, a predicate adjective. So we use the slanted line after the verb to show that our subject complement refers back to our subject. There is an adverb in our main clause, and two adverbs in our relative clause, one modifying an adjective and one modifying a verb. Our subject in the main clause is time. Our main verb is was. We capitalize it, which may help us realize that this is a question, because it's the first word in the sentence. When was there, or where was there? There. And we have an article modifier for time, which is a time. Our subject in our relative clause is you. The verb is another past tense of the verb to be. You were. And and our subject complement, the predicate adjective, happy, behind the slanted line. How happy were you? Really happy. And our relative adverb when, which now has to be tied to the noun time, the concept time in our main clause with the dotted line, and we just draw it down on a slanted line like an adjective, and it hovers right above the adverb when, which introduces a clause and makes the whole clause modify time. A time when you were really happy. And we're done.